My name is Yeda Karishma. I'm in my late 30s. I've spent most of my adult life being described with words like steady, reliable, and calm under pressure. I work in compliance consulting, which, if you know anything about that field, means I make sure other people follow the rules. Ironically, I built a career around detecting risks in systems while ignoring the risks quietly forming inside my own home. To most people, I'm not the dramatic type. I don't cry in public. I don't argue loudly. I don't post cryptic messages online. I listen more than I speak. And because of that, people often mistake my silence for simplicity. My husband certainly did. When he told me he wanted to install cameras around the house, he framed it as protection. "It's for security," he said. "The neighborhood's changing." He said it in that practical tone that makes you feel silly for even questioning it. And I didn't question it. Not at first. This story isn't about betrayal in the way you might expect. There was no explosive confrontation, no smashed phones, no dramatic midnight exit with suitcases. What happened was quieter than that, more clinical, more revealing. Because when I eventually accessed the footage he never thought I would see, I realized the cameras were never really about protecting the house. They were about control. And the footage revealed more than he ever intended. Not just about him, about me, about the version of myself I had slowly shrunk into to keep the peace. Over the course of this story, I'm going to walk you through what it feels like to be underestimated in your own marriage, what it feels like to sense something is off but not yet have proof, what it feels like when proof finally arrives, not as chaos, but as clarity. There will be no shouting here, no revenge plot, no villains twirling moustaches, just decisions, quiet ones, permanent ones. I'm not telling this story to embarrass him, and I'm not telling it to position myself as a victim. I'm telling it because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a relationship isn't anger. It's an assumption. And sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do isn't react. It's observed. Before the cameras, before the footage, before the quiet unraveling, I was the stable one. That's what my husband used to call me when he introduced me at gatherings. "This is Yeda. She keeps everything running." It sounded like praise. And in a way, it was. I managed our finances. I scheduled maintenance. I handled paperwork, taxes, renewals, and warranties. I remembered birthdays. I remembered medication refills. I remembered the small things that prevent life from collapsing into chaos. But there's a thin line between being appreciated and being absorbed into function. To his friends, I was pleasant, smart, but not intimidating. The type of woman who refills drinks before anyone asks. The type who laughs softly and doesn't interrupt. When conversations shifted to investments or property strategy, topics I literally advise on for a living, I was rarely invited in. If I spoke, the room would go quiet for a second. Not hostile, just surprised. Like a dog walking on its hind legs. I learned to choose my moments carefully. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I disliked wasting energy on people who weren't really listening. At home, the dynamic was subtler. My husband liked structure, predictability, efficiency. He said I was low maintenance, and he meant it as the highest compliment. I didn't check his phone. I didn't demand constant reassurance. I didn't escalate small disagreements into emotional trials. When he came home late, I asked if he'd eaten. When he traveled, I reminded him to rest. When he forgot anniversaries, I told myself memory isn't the same as love. I became fluent in minimizing. "Oh, he's just stressed. Oh, that's just his tone. Oh, he didn't mean it like that." There's a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't feel painful at first. It feels efficient, mature, adult. You tell yourself you're choosing peace. What you don't notice is how often that peace requires you to edit yourself. At dinner parties, if he interrupted me, I let him finish. If he corrected a small detail of my story, even when he was wrong, I smiled and let it slide. If he made a joke at my expense, I laughed before anyone else could decide how to react. Because I understood something most people don't. Social discomfort spreads quickly. If I absorbed it first, it disappeared. That was my role. Absorber, stabilizer, the quiet center. And to be clear, he wasn't cruel. He didn't yell. He didn't belittle me openly. That's what makes this story more complicated. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as aggression. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption. He assumed I didn't need transparency. He assumed I didn't notice patterns. He assumed that because I didn't confront every inconsistency, I didn't see them. And maybe, for a long time, I let him believe that. Because being underestimated can feel safe. No one guards themselves around someone they think is harmless. I wasn't loud enough to be threatening, not emotional enough to be unpredictable, not suspicious enough to be inconvenient. I was the woman who trusted completely. And that's exactly who he thought he had married. What he didn't realize was that trust and awareness are not opposites. Sometimes they exist in the same room, quietly, watching. If I'm being honest, the cameras didn't feel like a red flag at first. They felt excessive. It started on a Tuesday evening. I remember because Tuesdays are my lightest client days, and I was reorganizing the pantry when he came home earlier than usual. He had that energetic tone he uses when he's already made a decision. "I've been thinking," he said, setting his keys down. "We should install cameras. Front door, garage, living room, just in case." "Just in case what?" I asked, not challenging, just clarifying. Break-ins, porch pirates, you never know. The neighborhood hadn't changed. Crime rates were stable. I knew that because I track data for a living. And yes, I occasionally check local reports. But I nodded. "It makes sense," I said, "as long as we're careful about privacy." He smiled. "Of course, it's just for security." That phrase, "just for security." A week later, small black lenses appeared in corners I'd never thought to examine before. One near the entryway, one angled across the living room, one facing the back patio. The first small cut wasn't the camera, it was the password. I realized I didn't have access when I tried to check a package delivery while he was traveling. The app prompted me to log in. I didn't recognize the email connected to it. When I texted him, he replied casually, "Oh, I set it up under my main account. It's easier that way." Easier for whom? I didn't push, not then. Instead, I told myself something reasonable. He probably didn't think about shared access. He handles the tech setup in our house. It wasn't personal. That's the thing about the first cut. It doesn't bleed. It just stings slightly. A few days later, we had friends over. At some point, someone joked about being on camera. My husband laughed and said, "Yeah, everything's recorded now." Keeps everyone honest. Everyone laughed. I didn't. There was something about the way he said it. Not protective, not cautious, authoritative, as if the cameras weren't guarding the house, as if they were managing behavior. Later that night, after our guests left, I asked lightly, "How long does the footage store?" 30 days, he said. "Why?" "Just curious." He shrugged. You're not planning anything suspicious, are you?" He meant it as a joke. But jokes often test territory. I smiled back. "Only reorganizing the pantry again." He kissed my forehead. Conversation closed. But that was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not fear, awareness. Because in compliance work, when someone limits access to shared information, it's rarely accidental. Transparency is easy when there's nothing to manage. And I began noticing small patterns. He would occasionally check his phone while sitting in the living room, glancing up at the corner camera, then back down. If I moved furniture slightly, he'd mention it later. If I came home at an unusual time, he'd already know. It was subtle. So subtle that anyone else would have called it a coincidence. But I don't believe in repeated coincidence. Still, I stayed quiet. Because before you accuse someone of misusing power, even small domestic power, you need more than instinct. You need evidence. And I wasn't ready to gather it yet. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because once you start looking, you can't pretend you didn't see. That first small cut didn't hurt enough to confront, but it marked something. The realization that security and surveillance are separated by intention. And I wasn't entirely sure which one was living in my house. After the cameras were installed, nothing dramatic happened, which strangely made it easier to accept them. There were no confrontations, no suspicious late-night whispers, no obvious betrayal, just small adjustments, micro shifts in behavior that, taken individually, looked harmless. That's how normalization works. It doesn't demand agreement. It simply waits for your silence. A few weeks in, I noticed he would reference moments from the day with unusual precision. "You were on the phone for a long time this afternoon," he'd say casually, while scrolling through his laptop. "Yes," I'd respond. "Client audit." Sounded intent. The first time he said that, I paused. "Sounded?" He didn't look up. "You were pacing." I told myself it was nothing. The camera in the living room could see movement. That didn't mean he was watching. Maybe he'd just glanced at a notification. Another time, I left for a short walk without mentioning it. When I came back, he asked, "Everything okay? You left pretty fast." I blinked. "You weren't home." I got an alert, front door activity. There it was again. Not an accusation, not control. Monitoring. But he never said it that way. Instead, it was framed as concern, efficiency, information. And I kept rationalizing. He's just detail-oriented. He likes data. He's being proactive. It's astonishing how intelligent women can negotiate with themselves when the alternative feels destabilizing. At a dinner with one of his colleagues and their wife, the conversation shifted toward relationships and privacy. Someone joked about sharing phone passwords. My husband laughed lightly and said, "We don't really have secrets in our house. Total transparency." The table nodded approvingly. I smiled. I even reached for his hand. Because technically, that statement wasn't false. He could see the living room. He could see the entryway. He could see the backyard. Transparency. But when I casually asked later if I could download the app just to have it, he said, "It's easier if one person manages it." Less confusion. Less confusion. I started noticing something else. He would occasionally adjust his tone mid-conversation, almost as if aware of being recorded himself. Not tense, just curated. Performative calm. And I realized something unsettling. The cameras weren't just watching me. They were shaping the atmosphere. Disagreements became shorter. Silences became more deliberate. I found myself tidying up before calls, not because I cared, but because I knew somewhere a lens existed. And here's the part I'm not proud of. Instead of confronting the imbalance, I adapted to it. I told myself, it's temporary. He'll get bored. This isn't worth making dramatic. I've built an entire career on identifying compliance risk, on asking uncomfortable questions when something doesn't align. But in my marriage, I chose harmony over inquiry, because inquiry changes things, and I wasn't ready for change. There's a specific form of disrespect that doesn't insult you directly. It assumes you won't challenge the terms. It assumes you'll prioritize peace over parity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began adjusting my movements in my own home. Not dramatically, just slightly. Standing straighter in the living room, avoiding private calls on the couch, choosing neutral expressions during moments of irritation. I wasn't afraid, but I was being observed, and I hadn't consented to that dynamic. Yet I kept telling myself it wasn't serious enough to disrupt our lives over. That's how disrespect becomes normal. Not through force, through repetition, through your willingness to reinterpret it as minor, until one day you realize the environment has shifted, and you don't remember agreeing to the new rules. And by then, silence doesn't feel passive anymore. It feels complicit. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you've been cast in a role, not maliciously, not even consciously, but consistently. For me, that realization didn't arrive in a fight. It arrived on a quiet Saturday morning while I was reviewing quarterly expenses at the dining table. My husband was in the living room, scrolling through something on his phone. I could feel the faint presence of the camera in the corner, not intrusive, just there, like a silent third party in the room. He looked up and said, "You're good at this stuff. I don't even have to think about it." It sounded like praise, but what he meant was, "You'll handle it." And I always did. I handled the taxes. I handled the contractor disputes. I handled the insurance renewals. I handled the subtle emotional temperature of our home. He handled the tech, the hardware, the visible systems. I handled the invisible ones. And somewhere along the way, my competence became expectation. The reliable wife, the calm wife, the low-maintenance wife. The wife who doesn't overreact. I began noticing how often he made decisions for us under the banner of efficiency. I already booked it. I took care of it. It's fine, I decided. He rarely asked, "What do you think?" Not because he didn't value my intelligence, but because he assumed alignment. Assumed compliance. In public, he'd describe me as easygoing. In private, he relied on me to stabilize every logistical loose end. And when you are both invisible and indispensable, something dangerous happens. You stop being consulted. You start being counted on. There's a difference. The cameras fit neatly into that pattern. He didn't ask, "Are you comfortable with this?" He informed me. I nodded. That nod was the role, because I had trained him to expect it. Not intentionally, but consistently. I prided myself on being adaptable, on not sweating small things, on understanding that marriage requires flexibility. But flexibility without boundaries becomes erasure. One evening, while folding laundry, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The camera above it blinked faintly, and I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't angry about the cameras. I was unsettled by what they represented. They represented a house where decisions flowed in one direction, where information was centralized, where oversight existed without mutuality. And I had allowed that structure to form, not because I was weak, but because I believed being unthreatening was a form of strength. The role I had been assigned was simple: be competent, be calm, be grateful, be quiet. And I fulfilled it beautifully. What he didn't understand, what I barely understood at the time, was that calm does not mean unaware. Reliability does not mean dependency, and silence does not mean consent. The role fit me well. Until it didn't. Until I began to wonder who benefits most when one person is always easy, and whether I had mistaken emotional maturity for emotional minimization. Because once you see the role clearly, you have to decide whether to keep playing it. The shift didn't happen because of a fight. It didn't happen because I caught him in a lie. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:17 p.m. while I was standing in my own living room. I remember the exact time because I wrote it down later. I had just finished a client call, a complicated compliance review involving internal monitoring policies. Ironically, I had spent 40 minutes advising a company on ethical data transparency, on consent, on the psychological effects of surveillance in shared environments. After I ended the call, I sat there for a moment, looking at the blank television screen. And in the reflection, I saw it. The camera, not directly, just the small, dark curve in the upper corner of the room. And for the first time, I didn't look away casually. I looked back at it. It sounds dramatic when I say it like that, but it wasn't. It was quiet, clinical, almost detached. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen. Then I stopped halfway, turned, and looked directly into the lens. Not definitely, not playfully, just deliberately. And something inside me clicked into place. Because in that moment, I realized something very simple. If I were being observed, I needed to understand the observer. Up until then, I had been adjusting myself to the system, but I had never examined the system itself. That afternoon, instead of resuming my usual routine, I opened my laptop and began reviewing our shared accounts. Not snooping, reviewing, the way I would for any audit. I checked the purchase date of the camera system, the subscription tier, the storage capacity, the IP logs. I wasn't looking for infidelity. I was looking for asymmetry, and I found it. The camera system wasn't set to motion alerts only, as he had implied. It was configured for continuous recording in the living room during certain time blocks, primarily weekdays, mid-morning to late afternoon. When he was at work, when I was home, that wasn't a coincidence. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't feel betrayed in the cinematic way people describe. I felt clarified. Because continuous recording requires intentional configuration. It's not the default. And that meant the narrative of just in case wasn't complete. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. There are moments in life when anger would be easier. Anger provides momentum. It gives you something to push against. Clarity is heavier. Clarity requires patience. That evening, when he came home, he kissed my cheek like usual, asked about my day, complained lightly about traffic. I listened. I responded. I moved through the kitchen as if nothing had shifted, but internally something had. I was no longer adjusting. I was observing. And once you move from participant to observer in your own life, everything changes. Not visibly, not immediately, but structurally. I began replaying previous conversations in my mind. The jokes, the comments, the casual references to my movements. I noticed how often he framed monitoring as protection, how often he emphasized transparency publicly while centralizing control privately. I didn't confront him, because I wasn't finished learning. That Wednesday wasn't the day I decided to leave. It was the day I decided to stop assuming. And there's a profound difference between those two decisions. When you stop assuming goodwill, you don't become hostile. You become precise. And precision, in the right hands, is quiet power. After that Wednesday, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflexive, automatic, a way to smooth edges before they form. Now it was intentional. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become distant. If anything, I became more measured. I listened more carefully. I observed his patterns the way I would observe a client's internal controls. Not emotionally, but structurally. When he mentioned a package arriving at 11:03 a.m., I mentally noted the specificity. When he asked, "You were in the living room most of the afternoon," I responded calmly, "Was I?" and watched his face instead of defending myself. There's something fascinating about giving someone space to explain their own awareness. He would recover quickly. Oh, I just saw the movement notifications. Movement notifications. But the system was set to continuous recording. He didn't know that I knew. And that changed the dynamic in a way he couldn't detect. I began testing, nothing but noticing everything. I rearranged a small plant beneath the camera one morning and waited. 2 days later, he adjusted it back. It looked uneven, he said casually. Perhaps it did, but the correction told me something. He wasn't just collecting data, he was reviewing it. And still, I didn't confront him, because confrontation is loud. Documentation is quiet. In the evenings, while he scrolled through his phone, I started reviewing our joint financial accounts more regularly. Not obsessively, just thoroughly. I checked subscription payments, login histories, device authorizations. I wasn't hunting for an affair. I was mapping power. That's when I noticed something else. The camera system had remote access from an additional device that wasn't ours. Same manufacturer, different ID. It could have been an old tablet, a work device, something harmless. Or it could have been deliberate. I didn't jump to conclusions. I added it to my planner. Date, time, observation. Silence, when chosen, creates space. And in that space, other people grow comfortable. They assume equilibrium. They assume you're still operating under the old script. He became more relaxed around me, more certain. He'd occasionally say, I love that you're not dramatic about things. Or, you're just steady. That's rare. I would smile, because what he interpreted as steadiness was recalibration. I wasn't suppressing suspicion. I was collecting information. There's a difference between reacting to discomfort and investigating it. Reaction disrupts. Investigation restructures. At dinner one night, he mentioned a colleague whose wife blew up over something trivial. He shook his head. I don't know how he deals with that level of paranoia. I tilted my head slightly. Paranoia about what? Just checking up on him, wanting access to everything. Access. The word landed between us gently. I suppose access depends on mutuality, I said, keeping my tone neutral. He shrugged. If there's trust, you don't need access. That sentence would have unsettled me before. Now it clarified the framework. In his mind, trust meant non-inquiry. In mine, trust meant transparency. Those are not the same thing. And when definitions diverge quietly, relationships shift quietly. My silence was no longer about preserving harmony. It was about timing. Because once you speak, you reveal what you know. And I wasn't ready to reveal that yet. Not until I understood the full architecture of what I was standing inside. Silence when unconscious can diminish you. Silence when strategic can protect you. And he still believed mine was the first kind. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed when mine began. I didn't suddenly change passwords or open secret accounts in the middle of the night. I didn't call a lawyer in whispers from the car. I didn't confide in friends over wine. I simply did what I've always done best. I audited. The first thing I did was request a full download of the camera system's data logs under the pretense of optimizing storage. I sent the request through the support portal using his login, which, to his credit, he had saved in our shared password manager. He assumed I'd never need it. That assumption was useful. The logs arrived in a compressed file 2 days later. Timestamps, access sessions, device IDs, duration of live viewing versus passive recording. I didn't open it immediately. I waited until he was at work, and the house was quiet in a way that felt different now, not monitored, just still. When I finally reviewed the data, the pattern was unmistakable. Weekdays, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., multiple live view sessions, not just automated recording, active streaming, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for nearly an hour. He wasn't just checking notifications, he was watching. And not in a vague, security-conscious way, in a sustained, intentional way. I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of that settle. It's one thing to install cameras. It's another thing to spend your workday observing your wife inside her own home. Again, no anger, just clarity. The second thing I did was consult someone professionally. Not about divorce, about privacy law. I framed it as a hypothetical scenario during a networking lunch with a colleague who specializes in digital compliance. I described a domestic situation involving shared property and unilateral monitoring. Her answer was careful but firm. In most states, interior recording without full informed consent can become complicated, especially if there's an imbalance of access. Imbalance of access. That phrase stayed with me, because that was the core issue. Not the cameras, the imbalance. The third thing I did was subtle. I began shifting small financial structures. I redirected my freelance consulting income, which had always gone into our joint account, into a separate account under my name. Not secretly, just independently, perfectly legal, perfectly reasonable. When he noticed a smaller transfer one month, he asked lightly, "Income fluctuates?" "Diversifying," I replied. "It's smarter." He nodded. He respects strategy. He didn't question it. What he didn't notice was that I was building optionality. I also made copies of documents, property deed, insurance policies, retirement contributions, camera purchase receipts. I scanned them during ordinary afternoons and stored them in an encrypted cloud storage. If you had looked at me during those weeks, you would have seen the same woman, cooking dinner, answering emails, smiling at neighbors. But internally, I was rebalancing. There's a specific kind of power in knowledge that the other person doesn't know you possess. Not because you plan to weaponize it, but because it restores symmetry. One afternoon, while reviewing more footage samples, yes, I eventually watched some, I noticed something that surprised me. He didn't just watch when I was moving. He sometimes watched when I was sitting still, reading, working, existing. There's something intimate about being observed without interaction. It's not a partnership. It's surveillance. And that realization didn't make me feel violated. It made me feel finished. Finished explaining away behavior that didn't align with mutual respect. Finished performing comfort for a system I hadn't agreed to. He still moved through the house as if nothing had changed. He still believed I was the steady one, the calm one, the easy one. And I was. But now I was also prepared. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly. And by the time anyone senses it, the architecture has already shifted. There's a difference between suspecting something and confirming it. Suspicion keeps you alert, confirmation rearranges you. The private reveal didn't come from a dramatic discovery. It came from a mundane Thursday afternoon when I decided to watch a single archived live session in full. Just one! The file was labeled with a timestamp from 2 weeks earlier, 11:42 a.m. to 12:31 p.m. I remember that day. I had been working from the couch, reviewing a compliance matrix for a healthcare client. I had taken a short break, stood up, stretched, and walked to the kitchen for tea. Nothing remarkable. I pressed play. The camera angle was wide. The living room in soft daylight. I watched myself enter the frame, sit down, and open my laptop. For a moment, it felt surreal. Not invasive, just disorienting, like observing a stranger who happened to look like me. Then I noticed something small. In the top corner of the interface, there was a secondary window. Live view account 1. Duration 004912 active stream. Not automated storage. Active. He had been watching for nearly 50 minutes. Not checking in, not responding to motion alerts. Watching. I didn't fast forward. I watched the entire recording. I watched myself adjust my glasses. I watched myself pause and stare into space while thinking. I watched myself sip tea, scroll, type. At one point, I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes briefly. The idea that someone was observing that unguarded stillness, created a quiet tightening in my chest. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I hadn't known. Consent requires awareness, and awareness had been selectively withheld. I closed the video and sat in silence for a long time. There it was, the leverage. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that would humiliate him publicly, but in a way that clarified the ethical imbalance. Interior surveillance without mutual access. Extended live monitoring without disclosure. A narrative of protection masking behavioral oversight. The footage revealed more than he ever intended. Not about an affair, not about criminality. About control. About the comfort he felt in observing me, while assuming I remained unaware. That was the real reveal. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't even feel rage. What I felt was distance. A subtle but irreversible emotional distance. Because trust isn't destroyed by one dramatic act. It erodes when one person positions themselves above the shared structure. I opened my planner and wrote a single sentence. Continuous live viewing without informed consent. No adjectives, no emotion. Just a fact. That evening, he came home slightly later than usual. He looked tired, kissed my cheek, asked what I'd done all day. Work, I said. He nodded. Busy? Productive? He seemed satisfied with that. And as he moved through the kitchen, I studied him quietly. I realized something unexpected. He didn't look guilty. He looked comfortable, which meant in his mind this wasn't wrongdoing. It was management. oversight, maybe even reassurance. That realization hurt more than anger would have, because it meant we weren't just misaligned in behavior. We were misaligned in definition. He believed monitoring equaled safety. I believed transparency equaled respect. And those are not compatible philosophies. The private reveal wasn't explosive. It was clarifying. I understood, fully, that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could smooth over with another calm conversation. This was structural, and structural issues require structural decisions. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, I paused beneath the camera. I looked up at it one last time. Not as a subject, as a witness. And in that moment, I knew something with absolute certainty. I would never again live inside a system I hadn't agreed to. The question wasn't whether I would act. It was how. Once you see the structure clearly, you reach a threshold. Not an emotional one, a strategic one. I had 3 options. The first was confrontation. I could have waited until dinner, placed my phone on the table, and calmly explained that I knew about the live streams. I could have asked him why. I could have requested shared access, demanded removal, or insisted on couples therapy. That would have been the expected response. The second option was accommodation. I could have told myself that monitoring, while uncomfortable, wasn't catastrophic. No infidelity, no financial abuse, no overt cruelty. I could have reframed it as a personality quirk, a man who liked data a little too much. I could have negotiated minor adjustments and continued forward. Many women do. The third option was structural change. Not an argument, not a negotiation, a recalibration of my entire position inside the marriage. That option required the most patience, and it was irreversible. I didn't rush the decision. For several days, I moved through our routines with heightened awareness. I watched him, the way he had been watching me. Not with suspicion, but with study. Did he love me? Yes, in his way. Did he intend harm? I don't believe so. But intention does not erase impact. And here was the core truth I couldn't ignore. A partner who is comfortable observing you without consent will be comfortable making other unilateral decisions when it suits them. The cameras weren't the disease. They were the symptom of asymmetry, of control disguised as care, of a dynamic where I was trusted to manage the foundation, but not trusted enough to share oversight. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dining table, he mentioned upgrading the system. They have facial recognition now, he said casually. It could be useful. Useful. That word landed softly but decisively. I looked at him and realized something with absolute clarity. If I confronted him now, he would apologize. He would reframe it as a misunderstanding. He would offer shared access, and I would spend the rest of the marriage wondering what I hadn't discovered yet. Because once trust fractures at the structural level, patchwork transparency doesn't restore it. It simply masks it. That was the moment the decision formed. I would not argue. I would not accuse. I would not escalate. I would exit strategically. Not dramatically, not vindictively. Strategically. The irreversible option wasn't divorce itself. It was being prepared without announcement. Because once you announce dissatisfaction, dynamics shift, assets move, narratives form. Silence preserves clarity. So I chose the third path. I chose to finalize my documentation, to consult an attorney discreetly, to understand my financial standing in detail, to ensure that when I spoke, it would not be a debate. It would be a conclusion. There's a specific calm that comes when you've made a decision you won't reverse. I felt it that night. He was explaining storage upgrades. I was calculating timelines. He thought we were optimizing security. I was optimizing freedom. And here's what most people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It's not about overpowering someone. It's about removing yourself from a structure that underestimates you without asking permission. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. I didn't feel urgency. Urgency creates mistakes. I felt methodical. The first step was consultation. I scheduled an appointment with a family law attorney under the pretense of updating estate documents. It wasn't entirely untrue. We hadn't revised them in years. The meeting took place during a weekday afternoon, a time I knew he would likely be intermittently checking the cameras. I sat at the dining table deliberately. Let him watch. There's a certain power in knowing someone believes they're informed when they are, in fact, uninformed. During the consultation, I asked precise questions. What constitutes unilateral monitoring inside a shared marital residence? How does asset division account for independently generated income? What documentation strengthens a case without escalating conflict? The attorney didn't dramatize. She listened. She explained options. Washington is a community property state. Assets acquired during marriage are typically divided equitably. My independent consulting income, even if redirected, was still traceable. That was fine. This wasn't about hiding assets. It was about protecting leverage. Next, I ensured my separate account was fully operational. Emergency fund, 3 months of living expenses, then 6, then 9. I updated direct deposit structures quietly and gradually. No sudden shift. Predictability prevents suspicion. I also adjusted beneficiary designations on my individual retirement accounts. Something completely legal and entirely within my rights. Again, no announcement. Meanwhile, at home, nothing changed. I cooked. I laughed at appropriate moments. I listened to his updates about work. He mentioned a minor glitch in the camera app one evening. Strange, he said. It logged me out randomly today. I kept my expression neutral. Technology does that. What I didn't say was that I had enabled two-factor authentication on the shared password manager earlier that week. Small shifts. Structural shifts. I also drafted a written inventory of household assets. Furniture, electronics, vehicles. Not because I expected hostility, but because documentation neutralizes conflict before it begins. The most important step, though, wasn't financial. It was psychological. I began emotionally detaching in increments. Not coldly, not cruelly, but deliberately. When he reached for my hand, I still held it. But I no longer sought reassurance from the gesture. When he complimented my steadiness, I accepted it without internalizing it as identity. I was no longer in the role. I was the architect of my exit. There's a misconception that leaving requires visible dissatisfaction. It doesn't. It requires internal certainty. And certainty grows quietly. One afternoon, I walked past the living room camera and paused briefly. I smiled at it. Not sarcastically, gratefully. Because without those cameras, I might have continued accepting the imbalance as normal. Surveillance had exposed something far more significant than my daily routine. It had exposed philosophy, and philosophy is rarely negotiable. By the end of that month, my attorney had drafted preliminary paperwork. No filing yet, just readiness. Because once filed, momentum begins. And I wanted timing on my terms. He still believed everything was stable, predictable, secure. In a way, he was right. It was secure, just not in the way he thought. The first consequence wasn't loud. It was subtle. He noticed a shift before he understood it. It started with a small confusion. One evening, he mentioned a notification glitch again. The live feed lagged today, he said, frowning at his phone. Strange, I nodded. Maybe the system's overloaded. What he didn't know was that I had begun spending more time in spaces without coverage. The guest bedroom, the far end of the backyard. Phone calls are taken during walks instead of on the couch. Nothing dramatic, just redistribution. When someone is used to constant visibility, absence feels like a distortion. A week later, he asked casually, "You've been out more lately?" "Have I?" I replied gently. He hesitated. "Just seems like it." "I've been working," I said, which was true. There's something disorienting about losing passive oversight. It creates a quiet anxiety, not because something is wrong, but because information flow narrows. He didn't accuse, he didn't demand, but he began coming home slightly earlier, checking doors more often, standing in the living room longer than usual, glancing at the camera as if recalibrating. The system he had built was no longer feeding him predictability, and predictability had been his comfort. The financial shift was even subtler. When quarterly statements arrived, he paused. "Our savings growth slowed a bit," he observed. "I diversified," I repeated calmly. "It's smarter long-term." He studied me for a second longer than usual. He's analytical. He senses patterns. But he still believed I was operating inside the same framework. That belief protected me. The most noticeable change, though, wasn't technical. It was emotional. He began seeking reassurance in small ways. "Everything good with us?" he asked one night while brushing his teeth. "Yes," I said. "Why wouldn't it be?" He shrugged. "You just seem quieter." That almost made me smile. I had always been quiet. The difference was that my quiet no longer bent toward him. It stood on its own. He started initiating more conversations about future plans. Vacations, home upgrades, even the facial recognition update he'd mentioned before. I listened. I responded thoughtfully, but I didn't invest. When someone senses structural instability without identifying its source, they often attempt cosmetic reinforcement. More date nights, more shared planning, more surface connection. And to his credit, he tried. But here's the truth. Effort offered after asymmetry is revealed doesn't erase the asymmetry. It only confirms awareness of it. One Sunday afternoon, as we sat on the couch, he reached for the remote and paused the television. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "Maybe I should give you full access to the camera app, just so it's balanced." Balanced? The word arrived too late. I tilted my head. "Why now?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Feels fair." Fairness prompted by intuition of loss isn't the same as fairness rooted in principle. "I trust you," I said calmly. And that was true. I trusted him to act according to his nature. And I trusted myself to act according to mine. He nodded, seemingly reassured. But something in his posture shifted. He was beginning to feel something slipping. Not dramatically, just subtly, like a system slowly losing signal. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as an absence. And absence is harder to fight. The panic didn't arrive in the form of shouting. It arrived as restlessness. He began hovering more. Not in a suffocating way. Just present. Standing in doorways longer than usual, asking small follow-up questions that didn't quite land naturally. "Who were you on the phone with? What was that meeting about? Are we okay?" The last question started appearing more frequently. "Are we okay?" It's interesting how that question surfaces when equilibrium shifts, not when imbalance is created, but when it's corrected. One evening, he came home earlier than expected. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing a document from my attorney. Not obvious, just formatted in neutral legal language. When he walked in, I closed the laptop calmly. "Working late?" he asked. "For now," I replied. He stood there for a second too long. "You've seemed distant," he said finally. "Have I?" I asked, gently mirroring his earlier tone from months ago. He exhaled. "I don't know! Something feels different." And there it was, the moment where instinct collides with reality. He couldn't see the structural shifts. He couldn't access the separate account, the documentation archive, or the attorney consultations. But he could feel the withdrawal of assumption, because what he had relied on wasn't affection. It was predictability. And predictability was dissolving. Over the next week, he made visible efforts. He removed one of the interior cameras to declutter. He offered me access to the app again, more insistently this time. He suggested a weekend getaway. Each gesture was measured, controlled, calm. But it was reactive. And reaction, no matter how polished, signals recognition. One night, as we lay in bed, he turned toward me in the dark. "I've always trusted you," he said quietly. I stared at the ceiling. "I know," I answered. "And I'd never do anything to make you feel unsafe." That word, unsafe. I turned slightly toward him. "Do you believe safety and oversight are the same thing?" I asked softly. He hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you think watching someone protects them?" He shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a precaution." "Precaution for what?" I asked. Silence. Not hostile, just exposed. He didn't have a clear answer, because the cameras had never been about a specific threat. They had been about comfort, his comfort. And now that comfort was eroding. A few days later, he suggested couples therapy. "We can just talk things through," he said. "If something's off." I studied him carefully. This was the window, the last opportunity for a narrative reset. If I wanted patchwork repair, I could take it. If I wanted shared access and monitored transparency and negotiated boundaries, I could still pivot. But the structural issue wasn't communication. It was philosophy. He believed oversight prevented betrayal. I believed trust required equality. Those frameworks don't merge cleanly, and I had already moved too far internally to return to negotiation. When you've emotionally exited, even kind gestures can feel like echoes, not solutions. He could sense it. That's why his tone grew softer, more cautious, almost careful in the way he moved through conversations. But care offered after control is revealed doesn't restore innocence. It acknowledges exposure. And by the time someone realizes what they've risked, sometimes it's already too late to fix it. Not because forgiveness is impossible, but because clarity is irreversible. I chose a Tuesday. Ordinary days are best for irreversible conversations. They prevent theatrics. He came home at 6:12 p.m. I remember, Because I looked at the clock and decided not to delay it any longer. Dinner was simple, quiet. He sensed something. I could see it in the way he set his fork down more carefully than usual. After we cleared the plates, I sat back at the table instead of moving to the kitchen. "We need to talk," I said. Not sharp, not trembling, measured. He froze slightly. "Okay. I've reviewed the camera logs." There was a pause, not confusion, recognition. His eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. "I know about the live viewing," I continued. "The extended sessions, the remote access device." Silence expanded between us. He didn't deny it. That told me everything. "I wasn't hiding anything," he said carefully. "It was just checking in, making sure everything was fine." "For 50 minutes at a time?" I asked calmly. He inhaled. "I like knowing what's happening, Nice." "In the house," I clarified. He nodded. "In me?" I asked softly. "That's when discomfort surfaced." "That's not fair," he said. "You're making it sound sinister." "I'm not making it sound like anything," I replied. "I'm describing it." There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just a fact. "I never thought you'd care," he admitted after a moment. And that sentence was the clearest truth of the entire marriage. "You never asked," I said. He ran a hand through his hair. "It was security date." "For you," I answered. We sat there in stillness. He searched my face for emotion, outrage, tears, something he could respond to. There was none, because this wasn't a reaction. It was a conclusion. "I've spoken with an attorney," I said evenly. The word landed like a stone dropped in water, quiet but irreversible. He blinked. "You're what?" "I've prepared documentation, financial records, asset inventory. I'll be filing for divorce this week." No raised voices, no shaking hands, just sequence. "You're divorcing me over cameras?" he asked, disbelief cracking through. "No," I said gently. "I'm divorcing you over philosophy." He stared at me. "I can remove them," he said quickly. "All of them. I'll delete everything. I'll give you full access. We can fix this." "I know you would," I replied. And I meant it. But this wasn't about access anymore. "It's not the hardware," I continued. "It's the comfort you had watching me without asking. The assumption that my silence meant consent. The belief that oversight equals safety." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because there was nothing to counter. This wasn't an emotional explosion he could calm. It was a structural analysis. "I loved you," he said quietly. "I know," I answered. "And I loved you." Love wasn't the absence. Equality was. I stood up slowly. "I'll send the paperwork through your email tomorrow. We can keep this respectful." He didn't shout, he didn't beg. He just sat there, finally aware that the woman he thought was easy had been watching back. Without heat, without spectacle, without revenge, just clarity. The house is quieter now. Not because the cameras are gone, although they are. Not because he moved out, although he did. It's quieter because there is no longer an invisible audience in my life. For the first few weeks after filing, everything felt procedural. Paperwork, mediation sessions, asset evaluations. It remained respectful, just as I had intended. No shouting, no character assassination, just signatures and logistics. People often expect bitterness after divorce. They look for signs of anger, dramatic reinvention, and visible relief. I didn't experience any of that. What I felt was alignment. I wake up in the morning and move through my home without performing neutrality for a lens. I take phone calls in the living room again. I leave dishes in the sink for an hour without wondering if stillness is being observed. I sit in silence without being monitored. It's remarkable how much mental bandwidth quiet surveillance consumes, even when you're not consciously thinking about it. Friends have asked what happened. I don't give them the technical version. I say, we had different definitions of trust. That's enough, because the story isn't really about cameras. It's about underestimation. For years, I allowed myself to be described as easygoing, low maintenance, and undemanding. None of those qualities are weaknesses. But when they become assumptions others rely on to avoid accountability, they transform. What I understand now is this: calm is not submission, patience is not permission, silence is not surrender. I am still steady, I am still measured, I still believe in data over drama, but I no longer confuse peacekeeping with self-erasure. There's a difference between compromise and compliance. I know it intimately now. Sometimes I think about the moment he said, "I never thought you'd care." That sentence revealed more than the footage ever did. It revealed how thoroughly I had trained the world to believe I would tolerate imbalance. That was my contribution to the dynamic. Not weakness, but accommodation. And growth requires honesty. I don't hate him. I don't even resent him. He operated according to his comfort. I simply chose not to live inside it anymore. There's a specific strength in leaving without spectacle, in declining to perform outrage, in making decisions based on principle instead of impulse. That's who I am now. Not a victim, not a vigilante, just a woman who understands that being underestimated is sometimes an advantage. Because when someone believes you won't act, they rarely see the moment you decide to. And when you do decide, calmly, precisely, it doesn't feel like destruction. It feels like a correction. I didn't lose a marriage. I regained symmetry. If you've stayed with me this long, you might be waiting for a final twist, a confession, a hidden betrayal, a dramatic collapse. There isn't one. He didn't cheat. He didn't steal. He didn't scream or threaten. What he did was smaller. He built a system where oversight felt normal and consent felt optional. And I participated in that system longer than I should have. Not because I was naive, but because I valued harmony more than symmetry. That's the part I own. It would be easy to frame this story as a husband who spied, but that reduces it to hardware. And this was never about hardware. It was about philosophy. Do you believe love grants you access without asking? Do you believe silence equals agreement? Do you believe protection justifies monitoring? Those questions don't only apply to cameras. They apply to finances, to friendships, to emotional boundaries. The footage revealed more than he ever intended. But not because it exposed a scandal. It exposed an assumption. An assumption, left unexamined, quietly reshapes relationships. The moral isn't leave at the first red flag. The moral is this: pay attention to structure. If transparency flows in one direction, that's structure. If one person holds information while the other holds trust, that's structure. If you are praised for being easy more than you are respected for being equal, that's structure. And structure determines outcomes long before arguments begin. I didn't leave in anger. I left in clarity. And clarity, once earned, is difficult to surrender. If you were in my position, if you discovered you were being monitored for security without full awareness, would you confront and rebuild? Or would you quietly restructure your life the way I did? I'm genuinely curious how you see it, because sometimes the loudest power move is the quietest exit.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.